GST is considered to be the mother of all reforms, and who better? In conversation with us today at ET Now, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the show, sir. I think this is the biggest legacy of this government, GST, and congratulations on you for signing it off and for bringing that much elusive consensus. It is the single biggest tax reform in independent India, yes, but it is also has been the single biggest political compromise, has it been?
Not in the least. I think there is a great amount of political maturity which has come into Indian politics. And you may have some aberrations, but by and large, what's the pattern? Reforms are debated. There are doubts people have. But once there is a larger debate and a consensus, then they get approved by almost a unanimity. And we've seen that in a number of steps that we've taken. Of course, there would be difference of opinion in some.
Sure.
Now, GST has been a case where after a debate, we didn't want to rush through just by a vote, either in Parliament or outside.
And you've been able to arrive at consensus on most things.
Therefore, I spoke to the Congress party. I accommodated some of their concerns when the Constitution Amendment was passed. We then had the legislation, which was approved. We've now had 15 meetings of the GST Council, some of them lasting for more than 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. And we've almost unanimously been able to arrive at almost every decision. Now, you require a consensus. You require, you're dealing with the federal finances. And therefore, if you say that I am completely going to ignore the interest of 1 or 2 states, federal consensus is not arrived at by that. You may have to have consensus, compromises. For instance, 2 days when we decided the tax on gold.
That's right.
The council was almost vertically split. One half said retain it at 2%, the other half said it's a luxury item, why should you not charge 5%? And the extra revenue you get, you must accommodate some other products. But then we had to work out a consensus, and I must say, to the credit of the state finance ministers, an extremely responsible group, that finally when we did arrive at the consensus, each one of them agreed on the dotted line.
I think you've been asked on the GST since the day you swore into office, and many people have written, and it has obviously consumed a lot of airtime and print space. It is almost considered to be a panacea for growth, as if it is going to solve all ills. Is that over-expectation bothering you?
Well, I don't think the over-expectation is bothering me. I think we had a very, very complicated indirect tax structure. You had different taxes by the center, different taxes by the state. Each assessee has to have multiple interfaces with multiple authorities. Arbitrariness, corruption, and then you had India not as a single economic entity.
That's right.
You didn't have products or services getting the benefit of taxes already paid because you were taxing on tax already paid, and that led to inflation. And therefore, in the field of indirect taxes, it completely changes the rules of the game. India becomes one entity, you get the input credits, you don't pay tax on tax, there is a free flow of goods and services across the country. Most of the assessees will never get in their life to see the assessing officer. It's only very rarely that they'll get to see the assessing officer if they are expected for scrutiny for some good reason or the other. And I think it'll add to the ease of business, and a more efficient tax will give you better collections in the long run to the states and the center, and therefore more revenues to spend on development, and hence its impact on the GDP.
Indeed. I think the Kerala Finance Minister has worked out some numbers, and he says that the hit on the central's and the state's revenues will be about to the tune of ₹1 lakh crore. Have you done a back of the envelope calculations just yet?
We have done. Of course, if you take all the rates together, they are lesser than the present lot. Now, if you speak to some industries, they won't expect it, because I think some self-serving arguments in many cases are being given. But if you take the overall picture, taxes have come down.
That's right, yes.
So if government was getting X, it is today going to get less than X. But then that's the object of the GST. A more efficient system, a wider tax base, there would be a larger buoyancy as far as the tax collection is concerned. And therefore, if you see the future roadmap for a GST, as I imagine, you may from multiple rates come down to lesser rates, lesser brackets or slabs. And you may even have to cut down some rates if the base increases.
Base increases, indeed. I think your revenue secretary in Bangalore a few days back said that there is scope for rationalization of rates of some goods and services. You say there are, and you're right, there are very self-serving arguments that are coming in from almost all industries. Are you willing to review some of these in your June 11th meeting?
We are several governments which sit together.
That's right.
32 states and union territories, one Union of India. And therefore, you have to be answerable to the people. If some group represents, we'll consider it. Now, consideration will not be on the grounds of populism. Consideration is not going to be on the ground that some celebrity has come and endorsed a tax cut. It won't be on a ground that some industry
or some other celebrities say they'll go out of business.
You're being shrill over something or the other. But we will see. Our object is take the existing rates. Take the weighted all India average, not the average of one state or the other. Take the weighted all India average and fit the people in the bracket closest to it. Now, if we find that there is some deviation from this, or there's a calculation error, we can look at it. But I don't see any large number of commodities coming into this category.
I have a quick question, sir. You're right, and at least I'm one of the believers that if something has to be done, it should be done now, and why delay it? But why is July 1st so sacrosanct, and are you at all open? Because, you know, finance ministers like from West Bengal have said it is not going to be possible to adhere to
there has to be a cogent reason. The rules have broadly been framed, the rates have been fixed up. In the budget, you announce the rates one day and they are applicable immediately thereafter. So you've announced the rates well in advance. You've been telling people to come and register themselves. The the GSTN has made a presentation. The IT backbone is ready. Now, therefore, I do see that in the first 1 or 2 months, there will be some teething issues. And we want, irrespective of when you start, those teething issues are going to be there. Because people are switching over from one system to another, and we want to be over with those teething problems and go on to the smooth functioning. The earlier we do it, the better.
You know, sir, I think the anti-profiteering clause is a good clause because you would want benefits to be passed on to the consumer where they can be. Wouldn't you want that to be in place before the rollout of the GST?
You see, the anti-profiteering clause is already there, and it's been discussed in the GST Council. And we don't want to go about mindlessly prosecuting somebody.
Indeed.
You see, the idea really is to show the power and make sure that any benefit of tax cut is passed on to the consumer. And there is no unjust enrichment as far as a particular trade or a business is concerned. And therefore, we've set up a we've decided to set up a mechanism which will be a committee to be set up of some officers of the state governments and the centre. Jointly, which will administer and which will receive complaints. If they get a complaint, they'll find out. So that there'll be a screening process.
Some of us were very surprised that you finally managed to arrive at a consensus on gold because state finance ministers were speaking completely different languages. Having done that, you've created a new slab of sorts, 3%.
You see, gold even if it had remained at 2%, would have been a separate slab.
Exactly, yes.
It is neither 0 nor 5.
That's right, yes.
Now, the argument in favor of 5 was, it's a luxury good, and fit them into an existing slab. Now, even when last year 1% excise duty was imposed, there was a big protest and an agitation. And therefore, it's 1 plus 1 in most states, 1 plus 5 in Kerala, and a little higher than that, a little more than 1 in some other state. Therefore, we took a broad consensus. As I said, the council, that's the strength of this federal institution. Even when there was a vertical division,
you could arrive at a consensus.
We had to then go for a middle path. The middle path could either be 3 or 4.
But do you fear there'll be some other industries who would want to be in the 3% bracket?
We are not. We don't intend bringing other industries into the. If you've seen in textiles or in footwear, there were multiple categories.
Right,
We've just put them into either 0 or 5 or 12 in the case of footwear, and 5 or 0. Or 18 in the case of textiles.
I'm going to ask you a quick question on the politics of GST. And while most people are broadly agreeing with what you're doing and there is a big support for you, Are you a little disappointed that states like West Bengal are saying it will not be easy or it will not be possible for us to adhere to the GST? Can the GST roll out without one state?
Well,
or is that going to cause a disruption that you
see,
much rather avoid?
I don't think any state would eventually keep itself out of GST. I do believe that all states are responsible. A state may sound a word of caution today, but eventually if the GST does roll out on the 1st of July, every state will have to do it. Most states have already passed the SGST law.
That's right.
And I'm sure all the other states, and most of them are scheduled to do it. Jammu and Kashmir, which has to pass it under its own constitution, is also planning to go ahead with it. And the reason behind this is, everybody wants to be a part of the All India goods and services mechanism. It's only then that you will get the input credit. Now, if some state remains out,
you're not going to get the input credit.
You're not going to get the input credit, and therefore your consumers are going to pay more. And in any case, after the 15th of September, you will lose your right to tax.
And constitutionally. You know, I think GST was this one big tick in the box that had to be done. That's been done. What is now going to occupy all your attention?
Well, I think there are challenges as far as the economy are concerned. Always keep increasing and multiplying. There is never a finishing line as far as economic policy or reforms are concerned. Now, we have two major issues, both connected to each other, which is the banks and the private sector investment. They are both interconnected, and I think that's an area which we immediately need to address.
Talking about private sector investment, I have a very specific question there. What do you believe will be the drivers of growth in 2017? Will it continue to be the public sector engine of growth? And because the real deal is that private sector investment is not breaking ground.
I think you are driving on two very powerful engines. You are driving on the engine of public investment.
That's right.
You are driving on the engine of foreign direct investment. For 2 years in a row, we've been the highest recipients. The very fact that the world is investing in you means they see a potential for growth. I see infrastructure, I see investment in rural areas as very important. And as the third important engine is the consumption. The consumption is going to pick up. And once the consumption starts picking up, we will then see the idle capacities in the private sector
getting
utilized. And that's when we are also simultaneously trying to address the NPA issue as far as the banks are concerned, so that the ability of the banks to support the growth process also increases.
Are we saying we are 2 or 3 quarters away from that?
Well, I won't give a timeline.
Okay.
But I think the Reserve Bank and the other banks under the banking regulation ordinance have already got cracking. They've already started doing the preliminary work, and very soon you will hear from them.
I will come to NPA in just a bit, sir, but I do want to address growth. 3 years assessment is always incomplete without growth. I agree with you that growth turned down in 2016, at least the second half. Will you agree with me when I say that demonetization accentuated it?
You see, there are several factors which add to it. You see, we inherited an economy where there was no credibility of the Indian economy. We had fallen off the world radar. Nobody was willing to invest. Now, a series of policy changes, etc., we've made our mark. So, in the last 3 years, we started with 7.4. We are then 8%.
That's right.
And then if you see year ending 2017, from 7.9, even before demonetization, you were moving to 7.5 and 7.1. Now, as a result of the global economy, lack of demand, maybe also the banks adding to it, you were already on a downslide.
Yes.
Now, demonetization is an independent reform which was required. It was required because you either follow the UPA policy, which is we have an ostrich-like approach to black money. It's a problem that doesn't exist. Now, that's not the philosophy as far as this government is concerned. And therefore, you continue to allow cash to operate and so on in this manner. Now, you have to go cracking. Now, obviously, 1 or 2 quarters, it could have an impact. But let me just clarify. With demonetization, to end the year with 7.1%
is not all that bad.
Which is still one of the highest in the world anywhere, is a reasonable growth rate. And I think the curve starts moving again with all the steps which we've taken. And the other silver lining is that global growth, which was on a downward curve, the curve has started moving, and therefore the global tailwinds also will start supporting this situation.
So you don't think we are in a cyclical downturn of sorts right now?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I want to talk about NPA. You mentioned that earlier, and I do know that it's going to be a big area of focus for you. A lot of people believe that NPA is a good measure. What the market is a little worried about is that is the bank NPA beyond resolution right now? What gives you the confidence it can be resolved?
It's not beyond resolution. A, the problem is not so widespread. Bulk of the problem is confined to a certain accounts, 30, 40, 50 accounts. Now, to resolve that, there's a legitimate problem because public sector banks, which have supported industry, which have supported infrastructure, because of the inherent limitations in Indian law, where people become accountable even for bona fide commercial decisions, you see inherent lack of capacity to resolve them. So we've now expanded on the oversight committee experiment. Then the RBI has the overall power. They've already started making a list of certain set of companies. And once you go cracking on the first 5 or 7 companies, and what is it that you are going to do? You are going to use the mechanism under your insolvency law, and you say that either you pay up, or you take a partner if that's needed, or you exit in favor of somebody. And there are people with hoards of money, there are funds with hoards of money, there are people who want to come in. And I think world over it happens. You have the bankruptcy proceedings in the United States, you have the administration in the United Kingdom, and once somebody can't run, he can't make the whole asset non-performing.
That's right.
He can't allow it to rust. Then somebody else who has the money and resource and can run it should come in.
So I think it's a very enabling provision. I, for one, think it's a very enabling provision. I'm just going to ask you, because some people believe it's like a loaded gun. You've empowered the RBI, but who's going to pull the trigger? How is the RBI, I mean, will the oversight committees have teeth enough to now say, you get out of the asset, because promoters just like to hang on?
There's a mechanism under the insolvency law.
So that will have to be triggered.
The mechanism, once it's triggered off, will start operating. And if the first 5 or 7 cases go that way, I think the present status quo, okay, I don't pay up, what can you do to me?
Yeah, that's going to be done away with.
That attitude, I think, is the one which needs to be cracked.
Sectors like power and telecom, I'll just take one specific question on this. We did see RCom almost on the verge of a default. I don't want to talk about a specific case. They've of course got a lifeline now for the next 7 months. Will you be able to make, will you be willing to make special provisions for a sector like that? Instance in point is allow spectrum to be a collateral. I mean, there's some amount of
I think
discussion on that
the telecom
front.
department and the regulator, I'm sure, will look at all proposals. Because telecom in India over the last 2 decades has been a huge success story.
That's right.
And you don't allow success stories to create a problem. And therefore, it's a mechanism where you have a minister, a ministry running it. You have a regulator which is managing it. And therefore, it's the job of the regulator and the ministry to make sure that competition continues to exist. It's a fair competition. And you don't have all balance sheets of players in the sector going into the red and eventually translating into a problem for the banking system it is. That's something which is absolutely not acceptable. And I think both the Department of Telecommunication and the regulators therefore must rise to the occasion, and they can't preside over a successful sector sliding down.
So, you know, I'm so glad you were saying that, because at least you're being candid here. In some sense, you were saying it's a sunrise, sunshine sector, it's going down under, and the regulator and the government department together needs to stop this. I appreciate your concerns even on something like competition, but is telecom witnessing hyper-competitive streak that needs to go away?
I can understand good competition. When you have a big new player who enters and he gives you a rate, it becomes a consumer-friendly environment, because then everybody has to pull down the rates. And that's what seems to have happened. But then what is the extent to which
you can offer that rate or free rates?
After all, the whole concept of predatory pricing is something that is per se anti-competitive. If you acquire a dominant position and then are anti-competitive, and therefore I'm sure the concerned sectoral or the general regulators will look into these issues.
Is that also bothering you because that has an obvious implication on your own revenues being hit?
You see, revenues is an important concern, but if you have a healthy sector, the revenues in the long term are going to come.
That's right.
Just for the cause of my 1 year revenue, I can't allow a sector to slide down.
Precisely. Let me turn focus and talk to you about, I think, the big green, and I think consumers at large will thank the government and the central bank for this. You've been able to rein in inflation. I think we've overachieved targets on inflation. My question really is, and I know you will say it's an independent, autonomous institution, should take a call. Yes, it should. But as the finance minister of this country, given the fact that we've overachieved targets of inflation and there are no immediate threats to inflation rising, the global commodity cycle is rather benign, would you expect rates to come down by the central bank? Our policy is right around the corner.
I think there are two relevant factors in this. The first is that inflation is under control. The second is growth needs to pick up.
That's right, yes.
And investment needs to pick up. Now, obviously, under these circumstances, any government or any policy planner or a minister, his desire would be obvious. But that's not a desire that you impose on the system. Once you've created an institution like the RBI and now further created a very important group called the Monetary Policy Committee, I'm sure the data which I have and which you have, they also have the same data.
But with the same data, they seem to have a very unanimous view each time.
Well, I would not say so. Let us trust their judgment. And I, for one, will accept any decision that they take.
You were perhaps a very, very well-mannered, a very well-meaning finance minister. People in the past have said that they would walk on growth alone without the RBI. Maybe you may not want to talk about rates, but what about the RBI's stance? The fact that they turned from accommodative to neutral, was that a little premature? You think they need to go back to being a little dovish?
I think that's the wisdom of the RBI, and it's not fair for me to comment on it.
I want to quickly take a question on job creation, sir, because I think that's a big telling point for this government. You had decided and you had promised to create more jobs. Things aren't looking very good, at least right now for the Indian economy with this NPAs and all of that. But what is it worrying you at all, the kind of layoffs? Forget about job creation right now, the layoffs that one is seeing in IT? Because this has a dent on consumption.
When you have technologies changing and when you have disruptions because of newer technologies or for some other economic factor, you will see in one sector a job loss. But then when jobs are lost here, they are created elsewhere. I think there is a flawed argument, and the flawed argument has a motive. It has a motive because when we started 3 years ago the new reform process, why have incremental reforms? Why not big bang? Now, after demonetization, after GST, after insolvency law, I think that argument disappeared. We continue to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. You have to test your own growth rates in the context of a global situation. Then the new argument seems to be, is the growth jobless?
Yes.
Now, jobs don't grow outside the economy. So, if you continue to grow at about 7.5–8% in the economy,
that will be the kind
in the formal sector, jobs will be created. And I'm sure there are a lot of jobs being created in the informal sector. When you have schemes like the Mudra, you have a large infrastructure creation which is going on. Otherwise, why, if you had complete state of joblessness, then you'll have a lot of social unrest in the country, which is not there.
You know, while there is no social unrest, but as somebody who's a policy maker and has got his finger in almost every policy making that happens in this country, given the job crunch, are you more open to now reviewing labour sector reforms, for instance, allowing corporates to at least hire temp?
I think this is an argument one has to very carefully weigh. Carefully weigh in the sense that it's very easy to say it in the course of a meeting or an interview or a seminar that, all right, you've done all these reforms, what about labour sector? Now, labour and land are two very delicate areas. You embark upon those reforms which are possible. So, we've been trying to reform the labour laws, ease in the procedures, but which are the reforms in this country which are being held up because of labour? You see, I can understand when you were highly unionized and in sectors, investment was not being allowed, the age of strikes was on. You don't now enter into confrontation in areas which are in any case smoothly moving itself up. Now, I can see one or two sectors where there is a problem because there is still a public sector monopoly. The railways has it. In some states, the state transport buses have it. But I think by and large, Indian labour movement is a very responsible movement. You brought in private sector into the aviation sector in a big way. You had big unions. You've brought in big private sector into the banking system. You had big unions. You brought it in the insurance system. Have the unions in this country not cooperated in all these reforms? Have they gone on strikes day after day? The answer is no. It doesn't make a difference. Air India can continue to be a national carrier and its management somebody else pays for. I would personally go with what the Niti Aayog has said.
Which is to sell it completely.
To sell it completely.
Do you think you can arrive at a consensus on that within the
government? I don't think in the government there are two views in this. Whether these are strange bedfellows who represent entirely diametrically opposite political and moral values.
You know, you once in an interview had said to me that privatization is not a bad word, and even in the Vajpayee government it happened. It's not a dirty word. I still remember that comment that you had made. Are you willing to privatize Air India just yet?
Well, I've already said so, and I've given a good reason why it should be privatized. You see, if you are going to spend a huge amount, the public debt itself is 50 to 55,000 crores. Now, is this money to be spent on healthcare? Is this money to be spent on irrigation? Is this money to be spent on education?
Or running an ailing airline?
Or running an airline, particularly when your experiment of bringing private sector into your airports and into your airlines is highly successful. Now, I foresee over the next 1 decade, when we speak of success stories, I think the aviation sector in India has suddenly picked up and it's turned into you have more options, you have control, you have fares where even the average common man has started flying, you have airports which are now globally competitive, and therefore you already have in the domestic sector 86% of your passengers are flying in aircrafts which are run by private airlines. So whether it's 86 or 100, it doesn't make a difference. Air India can continue to be a national carrier and its management somebody else pays for.
So I'm going to ask you a very frank question. Are you going to find takers for Air India with debt levels of nearly 60,000 crores?
Well, I think the debt levels will have to be matched because a part of the debt level is also in the aircrafts that it owns. Air India also owns a large number of very valuable properties and then that can bring down the debt levels itself. And then it has some very powerful connections and routes which it has. And therefore, if you take over, if you do a due diligence and see its potential globally, I think the government, of course, will have to also step in and take a part of the share. But I think the whole amount of 55-60,000 crores which is being mentioned then substantially comes down.
So you're at least not dilly-dallying or skirting the issue some of your other colleagues
given a choice, I would personally go with what the Niti Aayog has said.
Which is to sell it completely.
To sell it completely.
Do you think you can arrive at a consensus on that within the government?
I don't think in the government there are two views in this.
With the airline?
You see, the airline is ultimately owned by the government and therefore, you see, disinvestment or privatization is the art of the possible.
You've said that before, yes.
I've always believed that from the day it started during Mr. Vajpayee's government, I've been saying this. Therefore, you're never sure that it will happen till it happens. Therefore, you have to find different ways. For instance, in the last 3 years, I have sold shares of certain PSUs. When the market was low, we bought them back. This is all the art of the possible. And therefore, we've been trying to make sure that what was lying locked in these assets can be utilized elsewhere.
As the Finance Minister, do you have a deadline in mind for Air India just yet?
No, according to me, the government should expeditiously, the Civil Aviation Department should work on this expeditiously.
I'm going to ask you two political questions. In the last few days, we've had many opposition leaders, whether it's Lalu Yadav or it's Pranay Chidambaram, your predecessor, and they've all spoken about vendetta politics, a witch hunting of sorts. I want to specifically speak to you about Mr. Chidambaram because he's written columns and issued statements on that. You've looked into the matter on this whole FIPB complaint. Where do things stand
Well,
right
I don't
now?
think, since the matter is being investigated by agencies, it's fair for me to comment on this. But I can only make a general comment.
Right.
You see, if you look at the kind of situation which has existed in this country, just as cash when black money was acceptable, just as cash and black money as a political donation was acceptable, I think this whole idea of whether it's politicians or in some cases dishonest civil servants or in some cases businesses, just round-tripping their own money through these shell companies, etc., and then creating assets out of this has gone on for too long a time. And now the country's mood is to launch a war against this. Now, in every case which the investigative agencies have investigated, they have no power to convict a person. It's either a court or an adjudicating authority, which is also subject to judicial review, which will eventually adjudicate these actions. So when you have a case of a former union minister and a former chief minister of a state in Bihar, where the people he makes ministers, he gets their properties transferred to the name of his family members. But it's as blatant as this. You have shell companies where assets are being transferred from the farmhouses to villas in South Delhi, prime land. The manner it's being done. Now, how long can this go on? And to say this is vendetta because you don't like me? But we didn't advise you to create shell companies. We didn't advise you to take payments in fake accounts.
You spoke about Bihar. Are we seeing the political contours change there? Are there overtures being made and accepted by Nitish Kumar?
I don't think any overtures are involved. Mr. Nitish Kumar has already clarified his position. But I am sure any man with a conscience would be extremely uncomfortable with the kind of situation that's happening. These are strange bedfellows who represent entirely diametrically opposite political and moral values.
But strange bedfellows make for best political companions, don't they? I have a last question, and that has to do with the statement that your chief economic advisor has made. He says there is insufficient criticism and people like to toe the government line as far as opinion, analysis and expertise is concerned. Does that make policy making difficult, and do you essentially
No, I don't think he said it in the context of government. In the context of certain economic decisions, I read his speech very carefully. And I don't think he was referring to the government itself. But he did mention that the quality of informed criticism at times is lacking.
He also mentions that people like their access to Finance Ministry and to RBI, and which is why they don't criticize enough.
Well, I don't think so. As far as the political institution like the government is concerned, it can always be criticized. People who disagree with us criticize us.
There is enough for more criticism. Thank you very much on that note, sir.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/etnow.